My name is Louise, also known as the Nerdy Archer across the internet, and welcome back to episode 8 of the Rookery's Archives. We're in for a lore-heavy episode this time. Exciting! Last time I mentioned that after combing through so many resources on the Isu and the lore, that I had put together a little hypothetical build for a mythological figure who we haven't yet seen in-game or even in the books and multimedia. This episode took so long to write as I had to reread so many books and academic articles, as well as replay the full Fate of Atlantis DLC to make sure I didn't miss anything out. But it's all done with love and attention, and what nerd would I be if I didn't put this much thought into something? I'm also super proud of what I've done, and for the sake of time, I've also left pieces out. An honourable mention must go to the articles which connected Artemis to Nimue, the Lady of the Lake in Arthurian legend. It's a connection I am particularly fond of and really appreciate, but for the sake of time and streamlining this episode, I left it out, but I might come back to it later. I've essentially gone full fanfic mode with this episode, but given that the original idea for this originated in a fanfic, I'd say that's a valid point of call. But I wanted to fill in a few gaps of the pantheons, particularly with the Greco-Roman. With Valhalla, we have the introduction to a full pantheon at once with the Aesir and the Vanir, aka the Asgardians. But the Fate of Atlantis DLC for Odyssey gives but a handful of the main group that the Greeks would recognise, beyond the main triumvirate already established with Juno, Minerva and Jupiter. I mean, sure, we got to see Hades, Persephone, Poseidon, among many others. But everyone wants their favourite person to turn up eventually, don't they? I feel like everyone has a personal favourite deity, whether it's one of the main 12 Olympians or someone smaller, like Zagreus suddenly having a spike in popularity following Hades' release. Plus, novels like Circe and the Penelopead are detailing the lives of several mythical ladies, and giving us a look at their stories in much more attention than they would have had previously. And a note before we begin. Darby McDevitt mentioned that trying to place each Isu into every single mythology perfectly can get tricky. Not all of them are perfect carbon copies, so let's keep it fresh. Greek and Roman myths lend so much to one another that it makes sense for them to be connected. The only way that I could see it working is if they were almost cameos elsewhere, like we saw with Valhalla do with Agraboda, etc. They're not the main players in the story, but they might be involved somewhere, or just a cheeky wink and a nod to the audience. Plus, each tale we spin about the world from those who came before expands it a little bit. So what is wrong with wanting something so new? This little thought exercise will also not touch upon anything to do with the Celtic side of things, so fingers crossed nothing I mentioned today will turn up in Wrath of the Druids. Is this a mistake to get me to talk about Artemis, knowing my reputation? We'll find out soon enough, because we're going to get started. So, needless to say, the appearance of the Isu is rather distinct. Ignoring the helmets and crowns, which honestly look a little bit ridiculous at times, and are actually only something they wear for flavour and the aesthetic, something I again can't see Artemis doing. They carry I'm just going to call them the Tron lines, markings up and down their arms, and decorated and presented to the extremes. Like, think sci-fi capital from the Hunger Games, but not gods. I mean, look at Hades compared to some of the Asgardians that we saw in Valhalla. Unlike, say, Persephone, I don't think they all had strikingly different eye colours. I mean, it is possible for humans to be born with purple eyes, as statistically unlikely that it is. And in canon, Ezio is basically shown to have golden eyes. But I would say there were generally what we considered the normal spectrum of colours. Out of those, a shade of green or brown for Artemis might work best. In the right light, they might even glow to look bronze. Depictions of Artemis, aka Diana, differ depending on who you ask. In some stories, she's dark-haired to Apollo's sunlight blonde. But I personally like the auburn ginger that Rick Riordan typically gives her in the Percy Jackson books. Sort of that warm autumnal colours you get during dusk. And I don't know why it amuses me to think that Artemis might have just been short compared to the other Isu, which in turn sparked the myth about eternal maidenhood later. Because in many adaptations, including The Heroes of Olympus by Rick Riordan, Artemis can change how she is perceived to be, but always sticks around to late teenager stage. And throughout so many different DLCs, we have seen how much taller the Isu are to humanity. So, biologically, twins are sometimes born earlier and a little bit smaller compared to a single child. Compartmentalised chaos, if you will. It could be a point of great contention with the other Isu, but they're two brilliant minds. So once they've proven themselves to be on equal footing with people many decades or even centuries older than them, it might be a little like, oh yeah, she's the short one, but I don't think it would be held against them. And I mean, to be fair, their society also had major important things on their minds, like The October catastrophe. Maybe their attempts to write out the Great Catastrophe was not a last-minute thing. At least not the beginning, not beginning in that final 10 years when the civilization ceased to exist. In my mind, it's treated something like current attitudes to climate change and global warming. There's been the research and the evidence for decades, all published and open for people to read and act upon and just listen to. But it's only right when things are reaching that tipping point of no return where you can't do anything except sit back and watch, that it's suddenly now a world-ending crisis where the action is being taken. Then perhaps you could say that the research, particularly as it was ramping up and all over the resources were being diverted to stop everyone dying from this solar flare, was centered around the Illuminati caste, this highest quote-unquote section of society, which we know that many of the EC figures, such as Juno, were a part of. But that's not to say that all the EC felt the same. Not every EC was out for humanity's blood and their downfall. In fact, there's several examples in the mythology that we have, pun not intended, where they helped humanity grow and learn and to defend themselves. So it's really not that much of a stretch to say Artemis or Diana, if we're referring to her Roman title, would fit into the side of helping to protect and defend. I don't want her character arcs to be about romance either, especially considering how many pieces of EC we have already seen that have been about couples, like Alethea and Loki, Juno and Aida. It's just not how we've grown to know Artemis in the mythology, and frankly her platonic relationships are far, far more intriguing to cover. Particularly most of her myths, when not including her brother, include her sisters-in-arms, the Huntresses. But as for the Hunters, if the EC figure was helping to protect people, maybe she taught humans and such how to defend themselves, especially if the EC-human war was ongoing at a certain point. Perhaps she even helped Eve. Some of the information about the proto-assassin essentially says that Eve was kept hidden from society in fear of experimentation. What if Artemis is even the one who helped Eve to defend herself, or taught her how to fight? Eve's parents tried to keep her safe from the other Isu, so who better than to act as a protector than the one known as the protector of girls and young women, to help teach their daughter how to fight and defend herself in the war they know is coming. Artemis did something similar in several incarnations of the Atalanta myths. Would not be far to suggest she might have done this multiple times to protect those of every rank in society. As none of her huntresses are confirmed as deities like her, or what we would now consider deities, perhaps none of them are EC2? What if they're humans before/early on during the war? The Fate of Atlantis DLC gives us Lyra, or Lyra, a human woman who was experimented upon in the Olympus project and could transform into a wolf, albeit not always by her own control. And as I was replaying this little section of the DLC, something came to mind. What if this is something similar to that? What happened to Callisto? What if she was one of those who was rescued or escaped, saved by the mercy of the protector of Atlantis, and Artemis kept her safe and beneath her care? Just a more literal take on the words Mama Bear. And going back to the mythology for a minute, Juno and Artemis do not have a very good reputation. They hate each other, as Juno is wont to do for all illegitimate children of her husband Zeus. But in this incarnation, she is not married to Jupiter, so the traditional reason from mythology doesn't apply. Instead, it's their ideals which make them adversaries. Juno, who sees humanity as nothing more than stepping stones, versus the Huntress who would die to protect them. Juno's father Saturn was murdered by humans, and she has the gall to ally herself with them. Just put yourself in Juno's shoes and see how mad you would be. It would also justify the reason why she isn't within Atlantis and why she was never seen during the DLC itself. There is no record of Artemis's actions during the EC-Human War, but given that she's about protection, I would like to think that she would only engage if people were in serious danger. Maybe she's instead helping her brother Apollo with researching the catastrophe. Project Helios, anyone? Or ferrying people away from zones of conflict as the rearguard. And with the Great Catastrophe incoming, what are her actions? She is the protector. How can she survive and protect people if she is also dead? Ergo, I am assuming that she might attempt a way to try and survive it, like Aita in the Norse pantheon. But I don't think that she was all that keen on it. If Apollo is a scientist, more of an astronomer than anything, he might have access to one final attempt. Rather than send himself through, he vouches for his sister to do it instead. She the warrior, he the musician. And it might seem strange to just tack in to think about Orion now, but what about him? In some myths, he's just a very swell dude. But many retellings of Greek mythology indicate that Artemis may have fallen in love with him in some way, or him for her, threatening the sacred vow she took on the river Styx. At the revelation of his death, orchestrated either by Apollo or Aphrodite, the retellings differ, Artemis immortalised his story forever by turning his essence into a constellation of stars. Sounds pretty similar to Juno trying to preserve Aita, no? Now, I don't think she did a complete carbon copy of her foe's motives. Stories have parallels, and people can make different decisions, even if the end result can mirror one another. Artemis has a brutal temper. Her grudge is lethal if you find yourself on the wrong side of them, but her heart is good. I mentioned in the previous video that we know few more benevolent of the Isu, and I would count her amongst them. And I don't think it's just her treatment of other people which depicts this, but also how she comes to know and interact with her sages later. We've seen how sages slowly begin to awaken, for lack of a better word, that Isu parted them through similar situations. Bassam losing his son, Sigurd his arm. For her it would be the loss of a very close friend, the sibling in arms dynamic that she might have shared with Orion. They still have the agency to do what they want. They work in tandem, only taking the reins when it's a literal life or death situation they cannot handle alone. And if there's the odd sarcastic comment ringing in their ears for missing that jump for the 100th time, then really, they have nobody to blame but themselves. Butcher continues to do what she's always done, and that's keep people safe. As a warrior leader in one incarnation, a suffragette in another, the possibilities are endless. Atlantis falls. The Toba catastrophe and the solar flare rip through the earth and decimates life to near extinction. Her brother survives, as does Minerva and a select few. They keep going, retelling stories and keeping hope and memory alive. Apollo, knowing one day his sister would return, and by Hades they were going to remember her. But that is all that I set aside for this episode. I really hoped you enjoyed it. It was immense fun to think about everything and look into mythology a little bit more, with a critical eye that I normally wouldn't apply. And world build a little bit to tie together loose threads and ideas from the lore, which we've really only seen once or twice. I'm genuinely tempted to write this as a full, fan-made story, actually. There's so many ideas that I came up with that didn't even get the chance to get mentioned here, like her infamous bow being a piece of Eden created by Hephaestus, or Selene, which sometimes is an incarnation of Artemis herself, being an alias of hers or even a title that she earned. I began thinking about this for the International Women's Day competition which the AC Sisterhood held, and seeing as I am a terrible artist, I figured I would instead provide a little audio episode explaining through it. Also, this is 2 months late, but you could argue I'm instead 10 months early for the next one. Next time, though, in the Rookery's archives, we are stepping back from the speculation and the myth to look at history and historical characters. And more specifically, a figure who was involved in 2 revolutions, appeared as an ally to many an assassin, and more recently immortalised in pop culture through a hip-hop musical. Is there anything else you would like me to cover? A figure, a name, an idea, or a listicle? Let me know down in the comments. As always, links and social media are in the description below, as well as a few select reading sources and recommendations if you want to learn more. You can also ask me questions about this. I love talking about this, and I knew it'd be a bad idea for you to get me to talk about Artemis. I just don't shut up. But thank you all so much for listening to this episode. This has been the Rookery's Archives episode 8. My name is Louise, also known as the Nerdy Archer. I have been your host, and I hope to see you flying back for episode 9 very soon.